It's my pleasure right now to introduce our Emerging Scholar Contest winner and first speaker. Amber Bell is a recent MA graduate in Public and Environmental History at Colorado State University. She earned her bachelor's degrees in history and zoology and a certification in GIS from Weber State University. Her research focuses on water ecology history in the West, which examines how humans and culture have changed aquatic ecological processes. Professionally, she worked as an intern for Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources as a stream ecology technician in the San Juan River and has volunteered with a Beaver Restoration Group. Her current research project is on trans-basin water diversion and fisheries in the Colorado River headwaters in Grand County, Colorado. Amber?
Thank you, Jeff. So I'm presenting on the environmental consequences of the removal of beaver during the Pacific Northwest fur trade. Beavers have been engineering North American wetlands for the past 24 million years. They were a very successful mammal in North America prior to the fur trade, with population estimates ranging from 60 to 400 million. And their range covered the entire United States and parts of Canada and even down to the deserts of northern Mexico. Oh, there it is. In montane drainages or on small streams or side channels of rivers, beavers build dams that retain water during the wet parts of the year, such as spring runoff or heavy precipitation events. As the water pools behind the dams, it flows over the banks into the floodplain, saturating the soil, regenerating groundwater, and raising the water table. This creates wet meadows and expands riparian zones. These ponds can be deep and hold a large volume of water, which is slowly released downstream or into the surrounding soils during the dry parts of the year. These wet meadows can also break up dry conifer forests throughout drainages. Beavers create essentially a wet mess that significantly increases the availability of surface water. Before the fur trade reached the Pacific Northwest, early European settlements relied on beaver pelts to purchase supplies from merchants and pay off debts to investors that sponsored their voyage. Thank you. For hundreds of years, European royalty and nobility had worn elaborate robes made of hundreds to thousands of furs. But by the 1500s, hats made out of beavers became an essential fashion accessory, making beavers the most sought-after commodity in the fur trade. By the end of the 1600s, Eurasian beavers were in steep decline throughout Europe, making North American beavers a very lucrative commodity and the source of some intense international competition over pelts and trapping frontiers. In the first half of the 1600s, the French established New France near Quebec, the Dutch established New Netherlands near present-day New York, and the British colonized the New England area. As these countries depleted beavers around the original settlements, they began searching for new trapping frontiers and clashed with other colonies. The New England colony began venturing its south in search of more beavers and eventually pushed out the Dutch by the mid-1660s, and New Netherlands becomes New York. New France also expanded its territory south and remained in North America west of the Appalachian Mountains until they ceded their territory to Great Britain after the French and Indian Wars. Then following the end of the American Revolution, the British territory mostly shrank to present-day Canada. Also, by the end of the 1700s, beavers were nearly extirpated from the New England area and the surrounding areas. But around that time, Captain James Cook's writings on the abundance of sea otters at the mouth of the Columbia River, it reinvigorated the U.S.'s fur trading ambitions. And after the American Revolution, the U.S. was able to push past the Appalachian Mountains and acquired the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. However, for the Oregon Territory, neither Britain or the U.S. could agree on who had stronger claims to the region, and they held a conference about it in 1818, which established the border between British Canada and the United States all along the 49th parallel to the Rocky Mountains. But most importantly for the fur trade, they agreed to joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. John Jacob Astor had established the Pacific Fur Company in Astoria in 1811, but the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, which are both British companies, had already been establishing forts further inland, like Nez Perce, Vancouver, and Spokane. But also following the overland path of Lewis and Clark in the early 1800s, American trappers were already flooding into the region as well. After the War of 1812, the Pacific Fur Company was forced to sell to the Northwest Company, and in 1821, Great Britain forced the Northwest Company to merge with the Hudson's Bay Company to stop skirmishes between the two, and the Hudson's Bay Company then turned its full attention towards enforcing its claim on the Oregon Territory. As one historian argues, the Hudson's Bay Company had learned a very painful lesson from their experience in North America, and that is that competition for pelts depletes beaver populations and profits. And their solution to curb competition with American trappers was the fur desert policy. From 1823 to 1841, Hudson's Bay sent trapping brigades throughout the lower Columbia River, or what they call Snake River, which was Shoshone territory, to create a beaverless boundary in order to make the region seem economically ruined and discourage American trappers from venturing into the territory. Alexander Ross's 1823 expedition was the beginning of their effort, but Peter Skene Ogden's expedition was the first real well-orchestrated effort to create this fur desert, and his company nearly extirpated beaver from the lower Columbia within 6 years. Ogden was succeeded by John Work, whose company only collected 866 pelts from 1829 to 1830. And in fact, in a letter in 1830 to a fellow Hudson's Bay trapper, Work described the lower Columbia as so exhausted there is little or nothing to be done with it. Prior to the fur trade, the Pacific Northwest held some of the pretty dense beaver populations. For example, William Clark near the Three Forks of the Missouri River in 1806 described being swamped in the bottom of beaver and complained of the difficulty he had navigating the Gallatin River because of the innumerable quantities of beaver dams. Also, Ross stated his company saw the course of the water stopped and formed into small lakes and ponds by the sagacious and prominent habits of beaver near the source of Adams River in 1817. He wrote that he thought his company had found the goose that lays the golden eggs when they counted 42 trees cut down by beavers within a half mile. As the fur trade, or as the fur desert policy progressed in the 1820s, beaver populations were rapidly declining. For example, in the Sawtooth Mountains in southern Idaho, which was part of the Snake County, Ross found 148 trees that had been felled by beavers within 100 yards near the headwaters of Big Wood River in 1824. The next year, in the nearby region, Ogden stated that Big Lost River was once well stocked with beavers, but is now entirely ruined. 5 years later, at the headwaters of Big Lost, Work also stated that the river looked like it was well adapted for beavers, but his company didn't find many. And then that same year, in 1830, at the headwaters of Littlewood, Work wrote that Shoshone had trapped 300 beavers 11 years prior, but now he suspected the rest were driven away by fire. He is complaining about beavers' habitat being destroyed by fire, but if in this environment, the health of 300 beavers, it would have been too wet to burn. When beavers were removed, their dams were no longer maintained and fell into disrepair or broke, so water during the wet parts of the year that would have been impounded behind beaver dams no longer sprawled out over the landscape. Instead, high flow events like spring runoff hasten erosion, causing the stream to insize, the water table drops, the stream disconnects from the floodplains, which dries out the riparian areas, and the ecosystem shifts from wet to dry. Also, if the water table drops below the stream bed, perennial streams or streams that are wet year-round become temporary, only having water in them during certain parts of the year. This shift from wet to dry reduces ecosystems' resiliency to drought and wildfires. Regarding drought, the water that pools behind beaver dams during the wet parts of the year sustains riparian vegetation through the dry season, because when drought conditions happen, water from the pond is gradually released into the surrounding soils and maintains a subsurface irrigation system for the plants upstream of the dam. They create an underground sponge, essentially. An example of this is when beavers returned to Susie and Maggot Creeks in northern Nevada in the early 2000s. In a 2018 study, environmental scientists Emily Fairfax and Eric Small used satellite images of Susie and Maggie Creeks from 2013 to 2016 to measure the normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, and evapotranspiration of riparian zones with and without beavers to measure if beaver dams increase riparian resiliency to seasonal drought and multi-year drought. The NDVI is a measurement of how green plants are. Plants absorb red light from plants absorb red light from the spectrum of sunlight, but they emit it back as green light through their chlorophyll. So the NDVI is a measurement of how efficient plants are at converting that red light into green light. So it's a measurement of how photosynthetically productive vegetation is, or how much sunlight they can utilize. So if plants are stressed by drought, they're less productive and less green. Evapotranspiration is a measurement of how much water plants are exhaling into the atmosphere, which is an indication of how much water plants have access to. The Fairfax and Small study found that plants near beaver activity had higher NDVI and evapotranspiration throughout seasonal drought, as shown as figure 7. But this trend also held true during extended periods of drought, which happened from 2013 to 2015, as shown in figure 6. Given that beaver dams can buffer the effects of drought, they also increase ecosystem resiliency to wildfires. And it's the same idea. When drought conditions occur, vegetation near streams with beaver activity have better access to groundwater, and they are able to stay green. In the 2020 Fairfax and Andrew Windle study, they found that when fire occurs, dry vegetation ignites, but the wet, green vegetation near beaver dams remains relatively unaffected. Or in other words, the NDVI stayed relatively the same throughout 5 different large fire events in places with beaver activity. And it leaves this obvious green corridor surrounded by a burnt landscape. For example, during a failed attempt to cross the Rocky Mountains in 1801, Hudson's Bay trapper David Thompson described a roughly 3-mile long beaver meadow with 10 to 12 lodges within the first mile, which is a pretty dense beaver population. But it had nothing but burnt woods on its sides. This fire had burned right up to the edge of this beaver colony. Enos A. Mills, an American naturalist around the turn of the 20th century, provides another example of this phenomena in his book In Beaver World, published in 1913. He described walking for hours through a burnt forest in the aftermath of a lightning fire in present-day Rocky Mountain National Park before coming across a beaver colony that survived the fire. It was in the midst of several acres of swampy ground that was covered with fire-resisting willows and aspens. Mills explains the fire had burnt up to the edge of the beaver meadow, leaving a green scene of life in the surrounding sweep of desolation. In the present time, these beaver-made green corridors have been documented following the 2008 Sharps fire in Idaho and the 2021 Bootleg fire in Oregon. So when beavers were removed during the 1800s fur trade and those beaver-made wetlands were lost, it increased the availability of dry biomass for fires to consume, and it changed the Pacific Northwest fur trade, or changed the Pacific Northwest fire regime. Prior to Euro-American settlement in the 1840s, the vast majority of wildfires were set by indigenous peoples. They used fire to manage their environment for their benefit, and they were cautious about not burning places that wouldn't have been beneficial. They set fires according to how wet certain places were throughout the year, which contained fires to specific areas they wanted to burn, and generally they set fires during the parts of the year where the forests were too wet to burn. For example, if it was dry enough, the Calipuans spot burned the Willamette Valley in July and August to encourage the growth of certain plants for the next year. As the season got drier, burning was more widespread to clean up woody debris to prevent forest encroachment. It also maintained open corridors for travel. In the fall, more places were burned to collect insects for winter food, and lastly, the valley's edges were burned to drive deer and improve hunting success. As David Douglas observed in 1824, the Calipuans intentionally left places unburnt to attract deer to those specific spots. However, with the increased availability of dry vegetation, it increased the chances of these fires escaping into unintended territory. In 1811, Alexander Ross first arrived at the Blue Mountains when there were still beavers in every stream, and he called it one of the greatest beavers counties in the Oregon Territory. But within 20 years, beaver were gone, and the riparian areas were catching fire. In the spring of 1826, Ogden declared the country had been overrun by fire last fall and complained the fire had driven the beavers away. That fall, Ogden complained that the country again was overrun by fire and it had driven beavers away. But as historians Nancy Langston and William Robbins point out, Ogden's real complaint, as he states more clearly here, is that these fires that had been set by indigenous people are ruining beaver habitat. He said the streams had not long since been well supplied with beavers, but the natives had destroyed them all, and probably by the use of fire. Yet it is not fire that has been driven the beavers away, it's that beavers have been trapped out, and these riparian areas are drier and susceptible to burning, and the burnt areas prevent beavers from recolonizing the region. In the In the fall of 1834, Captain Bonneville actually witnessed a prairie fire that swept over the light vegetation and assumed a fiercer character as it took stronger hold amidst the wooded ravines of the Blue Mountains. He said the burning forest made the mountains look like an erupting volcano. And the American naturalist John Kurt Townsend saw the same fire and shared a camp with Bonneville in the Ronde Ronde Valley. But he added that his company was having a hard time finding water in the ravines, and that the surrounding grasses and trees in the ravines had been blasted by the ravaging fires of the Indians. If beavers were as abundant in the Blue Mountains as Ross had stated, then these ravines should have had water, because in theory, beaver ponds higher up in the mountain would have stored water and slowly released it throughout the dry parts of the year. However, when the water table dropped as a result of dams breaking, the stream that would have had water year round shifted to temporary streams that only had water in them during wet parts of the year. And if these ravines had been wet, the prairie fire wouldn't have been able to use them as its entry point into that escaped this prairie grass fire. The fur trade subsided in 1840s because beavers were too scarce. There was an estimated 100,000 of them left. And also fashion trends changed and beaver hats were no longer in high demand. Around the same time, Euro-Americans were trekking along the Oregon Trail and settling in the area. And since then, several environmental changes have happened that have altered the fire regime, has further altered the fire regime. For starters, indigenous populations fell and the remaining were forced onto reservations, like the Kalapua. An estimated 1,500 of them were living in the Willamette Valley in the early 1800s, but after Euro-American disease hits, there was only about 600 of them remaining by 1841. And in 1855, they were removed to the Grande Ronde reservation with 11 other indigenous groups, which dislocated the people that had historically been maintaining the landscape of fire. By the 1870s, large-scale cattle barons were moving their operations from California into Oregon, and with them came invasive non-native plant species like cheatgrass that burns hotter and faster and covers more ground than native bunch grasses and forbs. In 1888, when the railroad reached the Pacific Northwest, cattle in the area increased, but also commercial logging and mining started, which changed the forest composition, and large-scale agriculture and water diversions and irrigation canals altered the hydrological landscape. Also, fire has been suppressed, which leads to an accumulation of fuel. And now climate change has compounded all these factors with drought severity and the 1970s. And by the 1970s, mega fires become a thing. These are fires that burn over 100,000 acres, and they have steadily increased in frequency, especially in the West, where there's little water and a lot of dry biomass. In the 2000s, several Western states have recorded having their largest wildfires in state history. This includes California, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, and Idaho, and most of these record-breaking fires have happened within the last 5 years. The 2014 Carlton Complex fire is the largest fire in Washington state history. It was started by 4 different lightning fire events around towns in the Methow Valley that eventually converged into one. From July 14th to August 24th, it burned more than 250,000 acres, destroying 350 homes and killing about 1,000 cattle. Overall, the fire cost $160 million, $1 million in damages, and $60 million the effort to contain it. Also, without vegetation to hold topsoil, rainfall that August caused massive flooding and caused massive flash flooding and mudslides. However, as you can see in this picture, the beaver meadow that's surrounded by the burn scar protected this drainage from burning in 2014. And it was the Methow Beaver Project that initially restored beavers to that drainage and are now using beavers to restore other sections of the Methow Valley that was burned by the Carlton Complex fire. And there are many, many other stream restoration projects throughout the West that are now using beavers and beaver dam analogs, which are human-built beaver-like dams to restore streams and gain back some wetlands as a response to the impacts of climate change. In fact, the 4th and 5th National Climate Change Assessments cite beavers as a solution to mitigate the effects of climate change in the West because beaver ponds store water and slowly release it downstream, which increases ecosystems' resiliency to reduce snowpack and drought. And those wet riparian corridors can slow the spread of fires across dry forest, and they provide a refuge for those plants and animals that can recolonize the burn area afterwards and help the landscape recover faster.